2 million people, 600,000 fighting men, an entire nation moving through one of the harshest deserts on Earth for 40 years. The logistics of the Exodus represent perhaps the most massive human migration in recorded history. Scripture reveals that Israel marched not as a chaotic mob, but as an organized force, arranged by divisions, camping in precise formations around the tabernacle, moving when the cloud lifted with military precision. But the Bible doesn't detail the staggering daily challenges this required. How do you provide millions of liters of water every single day in a waterless wasteland? How do you manage sanitation for 2 million people without creating a health catastrophe? How do you coordinate the movement of 12 tribes across desert terrain that would challenge modern military logistics? In this video, we'll uncover the hidden systems that made the impossible possible, revealing organizational details so sophisticated they rival modern army deployments. But here's the question that will shock you. Could this level of coordination happen without divine intervention? If this content helps you understand the Bible more deeply, then subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The next videos are already on their way, and you won't want to miss them. The vast expanse of the Sinai Peninsula stretches before us, a rugged wilderness of stone and sand that has witnessed one of history's most extraordinary journeys. Here, beneath the blazing desert sun, an entire nation once moved through terrain that would challenge even modern military forces. The question that confronts every serious student of Scripture is not whether this journey happened, but how it could have been logistically possible. When we examine the biblical account of the Exodus, we encounter numbers that stagger the imagination. Approximately 600,000 men on foot, not counting women and children, as recorded in Exodus chapter 12, verse 37, and confirmed again in Numbers chapter 2, verse 32. Conservative estimates suggest this represents a total population of over 2 million souls making their way through one of the Earth's most unforgiving environments. But Scripture presents us with something far more remarkable than a chaotic mass migration. The biblical text repeatedly emphasizes that Israel moved with order, precision, and military-like discipline. This was not a disorganized exodus of refugees fleeing in panic, but a structured movement of tribes arranged in specific formations. The book of Numbers provides us with detailed descriptions of how the Israelite camp was organized, with each tribe assigned specific positions around the central tabernacle. The text speaks of Israel marching by their divisions and in ranks, using language that echoes the organized movements of professional armies. This military terminology appears throughout the wilderness narratives, suggesting that what we're dealing with is not merely a spiritual journey, but a massive logistical operation that rivals or surpasses any ancient military deployment on record. The encampment arrangement, described in Numbers chapter 2, reveals a sophisticated understanding of large-scale organization. The 12 tribes were grouped into 4 major divisions, positioned on the east, south, west, and north sides of the tabernacle, with the Levites forming an inner ring around the sanctuary itself. This wasn't arbitrary positioning, but strategic placement that served both theological and practical purposes. God's dwelling place occupied the absolute center, symbolizing divine presence among his people. But this central location also functioned as the command and control hub for the entire operation. From this central point, signals could be transmitted, orders could be issued, and the movement of the entire nation could be coordinated. Each tribal division had its own banner and standard, creating a visual system that allowed for rapid identification and organization across what must have been an enormous camp. The geographical reality of the Sinai Peninsula adds another layer of complexity to this account. This region is characterized by rugged mountains, arid plains, deep wadis, and critically limited water sources. Archaeological surveys have mapped the various routes that ancient peoples might have taken through this terrain, And while scholars debate the exact path of the Israelite journey, all proposed routes agree on one fundamental point. This landscape would have stretched the limits of ancient logistics to the breaking point. The traditional route passes through some of the most challenging desert terrain in the region, areas where water sources are separated by days of travel, and where the margin for error in navigation or supply management would have been virtually non-existent. What makes the biblical account so remarkable is not just the scale of the operation, but the attention to organizational detail that permeates the narrative. The text doesn't present the Exodus as a miraculous transportation, where people were simply moved from point A to point B, without human effort or planning. Instead, we see evidence of careful structure, from the specific order in which the tribes were to march, to the designated responsibilities of the Levites in preparing and transporting the tabernacle, to the systematic way the camp was arranged and broken each time the pillar of cloud indicated it was time to move. This level of detail suggests we're dealing with an account based on genuine field experience, not a later theological construction created centuries after the supposed events. The paradox that emerges from careful study of the Exodus account is striking. Critics often point to the logistical impossibility of moving 2 million people through the Sinai as evidence against the historical reliability of the narrative. Yet, Scripture itself foregrounds the organizational and logistical challenges, providing detailed descriptions of camp arrangements, tribal formations, and movement procedures that demonstrate an intimate familiarity with the practical demands of large-scale desert operations. If this were merely a legendary account created by later scribes, we would expect to find either vague generalities about the journey or miraculous descriptions that bypass practical concerns entirely. Instead, we discover a narrative that is deeply concerned with the nuts and bolts of how such an operation would actually function on a day-to-day basis. When we begin to calculate the physical dimensions required to accommodate over 2 million people in a single encampment, the numbers become staggering. Modern crowd management experts estimate that each person requires approximately 10 square meters of space for basic camping needs, not including areas for livestock, supply storage, or movement corridors. This means the Israelite camp would have required a minimum of 20 million square meters, or roughly 20 square kilometers of relatively flat terrain every single night. To put this in perspective, we're talking about an area larger than many modern cities, a temporary settlement that would rank among the largest urban centers of the ancient world, yet one that had to be completely dismantled and reconstructed each time the pillar of cloud signaled it was time to move forward. The tribal arrangement described in Numbers chapter 2 reveals a sophisticated understanding of large-scale logistics that goes far beyond mere symbolic positioning. The Eastern Division, led by the tribe of Judah, contained approximately 186,000 people. The Southern Division under Reuben numbered 151,000. The Western Division, led by Ephraim, comprised 108,000, while the Northern Division under Dan totaled 157,000. These weren't arbitrary groupings, but carefully balanced formations that could function as semi-autonomous units during movement and deployment. Each division was large enough to handle its own internal logistics, while remaining small enough to respond quickly to central commands. The mathematical precision of these arrangements suggests military-level planning that anticipates the practical challenges of coordinating movement across difficult terrain. The process of breaking and establishing camp would have required choreographed precision that rivals modern military operations. When the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, indicating it was time to move, a complex sequence had to unfold with clockwork timing. The priests and Levites were responsible for carefully dismantling, wrapping, and preparing the sacred furniture and structures of the tabernacle for transport. Meanwhile, each of the 4 tribal divisions had to strike their tents, organize their possessions, marshal their livestock, and form up in predetermined marching order. Archaeological evidence from ancient Near Eastern military campaigns shows us that even professional armies with extensive training struggled to achieve rapid deployment times. The Israelites would have needed to accomplish this feat repeatedly, often in harsh desert conditions, while maintaining the safety and cohesion of a population that included elderly individuals, pregnant women, and small children. The sanitation requirements for such a massive population present challenges that dwarf those faced by any ancient city. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 12 through 14, provides explicit instructions that each person must carry a small shovel and establish latrines outside the camp, with all human waste properly buried. From a public health perspective, these regulations demonstrate an understanding of disease prevention that was remarkably advanced for its era. Modern epidemiologists calculate that without proper waste management, a population of 2 million people would face catastrophic outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, and typhoid within weeks. The biblical regulations effectively create sanitation zones around the perimeter of the camp, using prevailing wind patterns and distance barriers to protect the central living areas from contamination. The daily water requirements alone represent a logistical nightmare that would challenge modern relief organizations. In desert conditions, each person requires a minimum of 4 liters of water per day for basic survival, with additional water needed for cooking, basic hygiene, and livestock. For 2 million people, this translates to 8 million litres of water every single day. To visualize this quantity, we're talking about enough water to fill more than 3 Olympic swimming pools daily, and this represents only the minimum survival requirement. The biblical narrative records specific instances where God provided water miraculously, from the sweetening of bitter waters at Marah to water flowing from rocks at Rephidim and Kadesh. These accounts take on new significance when we understand that the alternative would have meant death for the entire population within days. The food supply chain presents equally staggering challenges. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Sinai Peninsula during the Late Bronze Age could not have supported even a fraction of this population through natural hunting and gathering. The region's carrying capacity for large mammals was limited, and plant resources were scattered and seasonal. The biblical account of manna addresses this impossibility head-on, describing a daily provision that arrived with mathematical precision. Enough for each person's daily needs, with strict prohibitions against hoarding except on the day before Sabbath. The logistics of collecting, distributing, and consuming this provision across such a vast population would have required organizational systems that functioned with remarkable efficiency day after day for 40 years. The archaeological record of the Sinai Peninsula presents one of the most intriguing puzzles in biblical archaeology. Despite extensive surveys conducted over the past century, researchers have not uncovered definitive evidence of a massive 40-year encampment that would conclusively prove the presence of 2 million Israelites during the Late Bronze Age. This absence has led some scholars to question the historical reliability of the Exodus account. Yet the lack of archaeological evidence may tell us more about the nature of nomadic societies and desert preservation than about the historicity of the biblical narrative. Mobile pastoral communities, by their very nature, leave remarkably light archaeological footprints. Unlike sedentary civilizations that build permanent structures, dig wells, and create pottery kilns, nomadic groups travel with portable possessions and temporary shelters that biodegrade rapidly in harsh desert conditions. The Sinai's geological and climatic conditions work actively against archaeological preservation. Shifting sand dunes, flash floods through wadis, and extreme temperature fluctuations create an environment where organic materials decompose quickly, and surface artifacts become buried or scattered across vast areas. Modern Bedouin encampments, which can house thousands of people for months at a time, become virtually invisible archaeologically within decades of abandonment. When we consider that the Israelite wandering occurred over 3 millennia ago, the absence of clear material remains becomes less surprising and more consistent with what we understand about desert archaeology. Additionally, the challenge of identifying ethnically specific artifacts compounds the problem. Even if archaeologists discovered campsites dating to the appropriate period, distinguishing between Israelite, Midianite, Amalekite, or other nomadic groups based on material culture alone presents enormous methodological difficulties. However, recent archaeological discoveries have shed fascinating light on the geopolitical context of the Exodus period. Excavations along the northern Sinai have revealed an extensive network of New Kingdom Egyptian fortresses and military installations that controlled the major routes between Egypt and Canaan. The Horus Military Road, a heavily fortified corridor that ran along the Mediterranean coast, featured massive fortress complexes positioned at strategic intervals. These installations, with their thick walls, elaborate gate systems, and permanent garrisons, demonstrate Egypt's determination to maintain strict control over movement between their territory and the Levant. The scale and sophistication of these fortifications provide crucial context for understanding why the biblical narrative explicitly states that God did not lead Israel along the coastal route, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. The contrast between Egyptian military logistics and the Israelite camp organization reveals intriguing parallels and distinctions. Egyptian army formations, as depicted in reliefs from the reigns of Seti I and Ramesses II, show highly organized divisions with specific functions: chariot units, infantry phalanxes, scout contingents, and supply trains. These armies moved according to established protocols, with advance units, main forces, and rear guards maintaining specific distances and communication systems. The Israelite tribal arrangement around the Tabernacle bears striking similarities to these military formations, suggesting familiarity with Egyptian organizational models. Yet, the biblical system shows distinctive features that reflect its unique theological foundation. The central sanctuary replacing the pharaoh's pavilion, tribal banners instead of military standards, and priests rather than generals coordinating movement. Archaeological evidence from Egyptian military campaigns provides important insights into the logistical challenges faced by large ancient populations moving through desert regions. Papyrus records from the reign of Ramesses II describes supply difficulties encountered by Egyptian forces operating in the Sinai, despite having established supply bases and organized provisioning systems. These accounts detail water shortages, equipment failures, and coordination problems that plagued even professional military units with extensive experience in desert operations. The fact that trained Egyptian armies struggled with desert logistics while maintaining supply lines to Egyptian bases underscores the magnitude of the challenge faced by the Israelites during their wilderness journey. The advanced hygiene regulations recorded in Deuteronomy take on new significance when compared with archaeological evidence from other ancient sites. Excavations at various ancient Near Eastern cities reveal that most urban centers struggled with basic sanitation, with human waste disposal systems that were primitive or non-existent. Disease evidence from skeletal remains shows that populations without proper waste management suffered from chronic intestinal parasites and waterborne illnesses that dramatically reduced life expectancy. The biblical sanitation laws, with their emphasis on waste removal from living areas and proper burial procedures, represent public health knowledge that was remarkably sophisticated for its time and would have provided crucial protection for a large desert population where contaminated water sources could prove fatal within days. The question of population size has generated intense scholarly debate that strikes at the heart of how we interpret the Exodus narrative. The traditional reading of the Hebrew text suggests that 600,000 adult males left Egypt, which would indicate a total population of approximately 2 to 2.5 million people, when including women, children, and elderly individuals. However, some linguists and biblical scholars have proposed that the Hebrew word elef, typically translated as thousand, might sometimes refer to military units, clans, or family groups, rather than precise numerical quantities. Under this interpretation, the 600,000s could represent 600 tribal units or fighting groups, suggesting a significantly smaller total population, perhaps in the tens of thousands rather than millions. This debate is more than academic hair-splitting, because it fundamentally affects how we understand the logistical challenges described in the biblical text and the scale of divine intervention required to sustain the wilderness community. The geographical mysteries surrounding the Exodus route continue to perplex scholars and archaeologists. The biblical narrative mentions that God deliberately avoided leading Israel along the way of the Philistines, the well-traveled coastal route that connected Egypt to Canaan. Instead, the text describes a journey through various wilderness areas, with names like the wilderness of Shur, the wilderness of Sin, and the wilderness of Paran. Archaeological surveys have identified multiple possible routes through the Sinai Peninsula, each with compelling evidence and significant challenges. The northern route would have taken the Israelites through areas now known to have been heavily fortified by Egyptian military installations, making it virtually impossible for such a large group to pass undetected. The central routes wind through mountainous terrain with limited water sources, but offer more concealment from Egyptian patrols. The southern routes pass through some of the most desolate regions of the peninsula, but would have provided access to traditional Bedouin water sources and grazing areas. The identification of Mount Sinai itself remains one of archaeology's most enduring puzzles. The traditional identification with Jebel Musa in southern Sinai dates back to Byzantine Christian monks, but lacks definitive archaeological confirmation. Alternative proposals include Har Karkom in the central Negev, where Italian archaeologist Emanuele Anati has discovered extensive rock art and cultic installations dating to the Bronze Age, and Jabal al-Lawz in northwestern Saudi Arabia, where some researchers claim to have found evidence of ancient worship sites and blackened mountain peaks consistent with the biblical description of God's fiery descent. Each proposed location presents compelling archaeological features, alongside significant chronological and geographical challenges that prevent definitive identification. The chronological framework for the Exodus presents equally complex interpretative challenges. Biblical chronology, based on the statement in 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 that Solomon began building the temple 480 years after the Exodus, would place the departure from Egypt around 1446 BCE, during Egypt's 18th dynasty. This early date would situate the Exodus during the reigns of Thutmose III or Amenhotep II, periods when Egyptian military power was at its zenith and extensive records document campaigns and administrative activities throughout the Levant. However, archaeological evidence from Canaan suggests that many of the cities described as conquered by Joshua show destruction layers dating to the 13th century BCE, supporting a late date that would place the Exodus during the 19th dynasty under pharaohs like Seti I or Rameses II. Each chronological framework creates different historical contexts and archaeological expectations, yet neither has produced unambiguous confirmation of the biblical narrative. The scarcity of direct physical evidence for the Exodus has led some scholars to propose that the absence itself carries interpretative weight. Nomadic societies, particularly those maintaining temporary encampments, leave remarkably few durable traces in the archaeological record. Modern Bedouin groups can occupy an area for months or even years, then move on, leaving behind only scattered pottery sherds, fire-cracked rocks, and organic materials that decompose rapidly in desert conditions. The Israelite community, as described in Scripture, would have used primarily organic materials for shelter, carried their possessions with them, and buried their waste, according to strict sanitation laws. Additionally, the harsh environmental conditions of the Sinai Peninsula work actively against archaeological preservation through sand burial, flash flooding, and extreme temperature fluctuations that break down both organic and inorganic materials over time. Perhaps most significantly, the biblical text itself suggests that the lack of conventional archaeological evidence might be intentional. The pillar of cloud by day and fire by night represents divine guidance that transcends normal human navigation methods. The provision of manna and water from rocks indicates supernatural sustenance that bypasses traditional supply chains. The preservation of clothing and sandals that did not wear out during 40 years of desert travel suggests divine maintenance of material possessions that would normally deteriorate rapidly. These elements of the narrative point toward a journey sustained by continuous miraculous intervention rather than conventional logistics, which would naturally leave fewer traces in the archaeological record while highlighting the inadequacy of human planning to accomplish such a feat. The meticulous organizational details that permeate the Exodus narrative reveal profound theological truths about the character of God that extend far beyond historical or archaeological considerations. The precise arrangement of tribal camps, the systematic approach to sanitation, and the coordinated movement of millions of people through hostile terrain all point to a divine nature that brings order out of chaos, structure out of confusion, and purpose out of apparent impossibility. This theme of divine order echoes the creation account itself, where God systematically organizes the formless void into a structured cosmos, establishing boundaries between light and darkness, waters above and waters below, and creating distinct realms for different forms of life. The Israelite camp, with its carefully defined tribal positions radiating outward from the central tabernacle, becomes a microcosm of divine order imposed upon the chaotic wilderness, demonstrating that God's character remains consistent whether he is creating the universe or shepherding a nation through the desert. The sanitation laws recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 23 take on profound theological significance when understood not merely as practical hygiene measures, but as expressions of holiness requirements for a people called to dwell in God's presence. The command that each person must carry a small shovel and bury human waste outside the camp concludes with the crucial theological statement, "For the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and to give up your enemies before you. Therefore your camp must be holy, that he may not see anything indecent among you and turn away from you." This connection between physical cleanliness and spiritual holiness establishes a principle that runs throughout Scripture. The presence of the Holy God requires comprehensive purity that encompasses both moral and physical dimensions. The camp's cleanliness becomes not merely a matter of public health, but a prerequisite for maintaining divine presence among the people. The centrality of the tabernacle within the Israelite camp structure carries implications that extend far beyond ancient Near Eastern worship practices into fundamental questions about life priorities and spiritual order. Every aspect of daily life in the wilderness community was organized around the dwelling place of God, from the positioning of tribal camps to the sequence of movement when the cloud lifted. This arrangement demonstrates that authentic spiritual life requires deliberate reordering of priorities so that worship and divine relationship occupy the central position rather than peripheral roles. Modern believers living in cultures that fragment life into secular and sacred compartments can find profound challenge in the Israelite model, where God's presence literally stood at the geographic and social center of the entire community, affecting everything from where people pitched their tents to how they disposed of waste to when they packed up and moved forward. The prophetic literature of the Old Testament repeatedly draws upon Exodus imagery to describe future divine interventions and restorations, suggesting that the wilderness journey establishes patterns that extend beyond historical events into eschatological fulfillment. Isaiah chapter 43 describes a future deliverance that will surpass even the Exodus from Egypt. Behold, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. Jeremiah chapter 31 prophesies a new covenant that will be established when God again leads his people from exile. He who scattered Israel will gather him and will keep him as a shepherd keeps his flock. These prophetic visions consistently portray God as the divine shepherd who guides, provides, and protects his people through impossible circumstances, using the same language and imagery that characterizes the wilderness narratives. The book of Revelation brings this prophetic trajectory to its ultimate fulfillment, describing a great multitude that no one can number, from every nation and tribe and people and language, standing before the throne of God. Significantly, this multitude is described as those who come out of the Great Tribulation, echoing the pattern of deliverance through suffering that characterizes the Exodus experience. The vision continues with imagery that directly parallels the wilderness provision. They shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb in the midst of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. This eschatological vision suggests that the logistical impossibilities of the Exodus find their ultimate resolution not in human planning or natural provision, but in divine shepherding that transcends the limitations of physical existence. The mathematical impossibilities that characterize the Exodus narrative ultimately serve to highlight the inadequacy of human resources and planning when confronted with truly impossible situations. The God who could coordinate the daily movement of 2 million people through trackless desert, who could provide millions of liters of water from rocks, who could rain bread from heaven with mathematical precision for 40 years, demonstrates power over logistics that human generals and supply officers can barely comprehend. For contemporary believers facing overwhelming circumstances, financial impossibilities, or seemingly insurmountable obstacles, the Exodus account offers not merely historical inspiration, but practical theology about trusting divine provision when human resources prove utterly inadequate to meet the challenge.